Imagine this: a silent ocean, a rising sun, and across the horizon, a fleet that shouldn't be there. On the morning of December 7, 1941, the United States woke up to a nightmare it had never imagined. Burning battleships, exploding airfields, entire squadrons destroyed before their engines even started. In that single hour, Japan became, on paper, the strongest naval power in the Pacific. And the United States? The world thought it was finished before the war had even begun. But here's the question that still fascinates historians. How did a country that was caught completely off guard turn into the side that rewrote the entire map of the Pacific? Because the truth is brutal. In 1941, the U.S. Navy was not ready. Its ships were outdated. Its doctrine was old. Its bases were scattered. Its leadership was still training for a different kind of war. Japan, meanwhile, entered the conflict with superior naval aviation, elite carrier pilots, experienced commanders, advanced torpedoes, and an offensive plan that had been rehearsed for years. The U.S. had none of that. And yet, 4 years later, the Pacific belonged entirely to America. How? To answer that, we must return to the moment right after the disaster, a moment when the world expected the U.S. to collapse, but instead something very different happened. The flames at Pearl Harbor had not yet been extinguished when the first strategic shift began. In war rooms across the country, officers, mathematicians, engineers, and analysts gathered not to seek revenge, but to understand. Every fact was placed on the table, every assumption challenged, every weakness dissected. Not a single moment of the early defeat was ignored. The U.S. didn't just react, it learned. It saw that the old world of naval warfare was dead. Battleships were no longer the kings of the ocean. Distance and speed mattered more than armor. Air power was no longer support. It was the battlefield. And from this realization emerged the foundation of the American counterattack. Factories that once produced cars began producing engines for aircraft carriers. Shipyards that built 2 ships a year began launching 2 a month. Pilots who had never seen combat were being trained faster than any nation had ever done before. The enemy had planned for a short war. The United States prepared for a long one. Every defeat became a blueprint. Every setback became a warning. Every mistake turned into a weapon. By early 1942, America had already begun to transform from a nation in shock into a machine of strategy, logistics, and innovation. And quietly, almost invisibly, the balance of power began to shift. The question was no longer, can the U.S. survive? It was becoming, when will the U.S. strike back, and how hard? In the next part, we enter the turning points where this transformation finally took form. Moments when intelligence, timing, and a handful of bold decisions changed the direction of the entire Pacific War. Before the ships, before the carriers, before the counterattacks, the United States won something far more important. Time. Time to rethink. Time to reorganize. Time to transform disaster into strategy. And that transformation began in the most unexpected place. A quiet room filled not with soldiers, but with mathematicians, linguists, and radio operators. Because before the U.S. ever defeated Japan on the ocean, it began defeating Japan in the one arena where battleships and aircraft meant nothing: the code rooms. In early 1942, while the world believed America was still reeling, a team of cryptanalysts in Pearl Harbor and Washington had already started turning surprise into opportunity. They were young, many barely out of university, armed not with weapons, but with pencils, typewriters, and endless sheets of encrypted messages. And slowly, piece by piece, They began mapping the invisible nervous system of the Japanese fleet. It was the beginning of what historians later called the quiet turning point of the Pacific War. Because wars are not only won by firepower, they are won by knowledge, and the U.S. was learning fast. By spring 1942, American analysts had broken portions of the Japanese naval code, not completely, but enough to see patterns where previously there had been only noise. Suddenly, fleet movements were no longer mysteries. Convoys were no longer unpredictable. The enemy's timing was no longer a secret known only to him. Japan still held the initiative. But for the first time, the United States could see the shadows moving behind the curtain. And that changed everything. One of the most dramatic examples came in the weeks leading up to the first major carrier battles. American commanders were warned, quietly, discreetly, confidently, that something enormous was coming. Not a rumor, not speculation. A calculated signal pulled from coded transmissions. The U.S. was outnumbered, outgunned, still recovering. But now it possessed something Japan did not expect America to acquire so quickly: awareness. And with awareness came the first small victories, ambushes that offset numerical disadvantages, evacuations timed to the minute, convoys redirected just in time. Japan was still advancing, but its punches were no longer invisible. Every intercepted message became a thread, and those threads slowly formed a map that showed where Japan would move next, and even more importantly, where it was weakest. But information alone does not win wars. You must use it. And the United States used it decisively. When analysts discovered hints of a major Japanese operation in the Central Pacific, commanders did something bold. They set a trap. A trap not built from steel or gunpowder, but from prediction. Japanese commanders believed they would strike first. They believed they controlled the timing. They believed their opponents were still recovering. They did not realize that their own encrypted reports had already given the U.S. a blueprint of their intentions. The Americans did not yet have superior numbers. They did not yet have superior pilots. But for the first time, they had the advantage of foresight. And in war, foresight is worth more than any battleship. Still, information was only the first step. It needed something else, something far more dangerous, far more daring. A battlefield where that knowledge could be turned into a real, physical, undeniable victory. And that battlefield was approaching faster than either side realized. In the next part, we step into the moment that changed the entire balance of the Pacific War. A single confrontation where everything the U.S. had learned, everything it had built, and everything it had sacrificed suddenly came together. A moment known today as one of the most pivotal turning points in naval history. There are battles that are fought with strength, battles fought with courage, and battles fought with desperation. But Midway was fought with knowledge. When June 1942 arrived, the U.S. Navy was still battered, rebuilding, not yet the dominant force it would become. It had fewer carriers, fewer trained pilots, and far less experience. Japan, meanwhile, entered the battle with confidence born from early victories. Its fleet was larger. Its air groups were veterans. Its commanders believed they understood American weaknesses better than anyone. They expected a quick, clean strike, a repeat of the success that had shaken the world months earlier. What they did not know was that the United States had already pulled aside the veil and seen the outline of their entire plan. Days before the battle began, American codebreakers had identified the target. They knew the timing. They knew the approximate strength. They even knew how the Japanese would sequence their attacks. The U.S. did not have more ships, but it had something no fleet had ever possessed so clearly: the ability to be in the right place before the enemy even realized the place mattered. This was the quiet miracle of Midway. Picture the scene. 3 American carriers moving through the vast Pacific, silent, hidden, knowing that somewhere beyond the horizon there was a force nearly twice their size. The ocean was calm, almost too calm, and on the decks stood pilots who were about to fight in a battle they had trained for but never experienced. They were young. Many had flown only a handful of combat missions. They knew the odds. But they also knew that this was the moment that would decide whether the Pacific would become a graveyard or a turning point. Japan struck first, just as predicted. Bombs rained down on Midway Atoll, smoke rising into the morning sky. But the island held. The runways survived. And the Japanese carriers began preparing their planes for another wave. It was during this fragile window, this tiny, vulnerable moment, when the enemy decks were crowded with fuel hoses, bombs, and aircraft, that the U.S. made its move. American squadrons launched into the air, not knowing if they would return. Some never found the enemy. Some were shot down before firing a single round. Entire torpedo groups were lost in what seemed like a hopeless sacrifice. But their sacrifice did something that no amount of planning could predict. It pulled Japanese fighters out of position. High above the ocean, while Japanese pilots chased the low-flying American attackers, another group appeared. Dive bombers arriving at the perfect moment, at the perfect altitude, from the perfect direction. They looked down and saw what every commander dreams of: 4 enemy carriers, their decks crowded, their crews exposed, their planes immobilized. A single strike could change the future. And it did. In less than 6 minutes, 3 Japanese carriers were burning. Another would fall shortly after. Japan had lost the core of its naval aviation, its best pilots, its irreplaceable carriers, its momentum. The ocean that had been filled with confidence now echoed with disbelief. Midway was not just a battle. It was a shift in gravity. From that moment on, Japan would be reacting, and the United States would be choosing the terms of the war. But if Midway was the turning point, it was only the beginning. Because winning one battle does not win an ocean. In the next part, we dive into the force that truly made American victory possible, something bigger than any fleet, more powerful than any aircraft, and more decisive than any single battle. A force the world had never seen before. Industrial supremacy turned into military momentum. Midway changed the direction of the war, but industry decided its outcome. Because after the smoke cleared, after the carriers sank, after the ocean swallowed the last burning wreckage, one truth became unavoidable. Japan could not replace what it lost. The United States could. And not slowly, not eventually, but at a speed the world had never seen before. When America entered the war, many believed distance would be its greatest weakness. The Pacific was too vast, the supply lines too long, the logistics too complicated. But the U.S. turned this weakness into its greatest strength. Factories across the country shifted from civilian production to a scale of military manufacturing that had no precedent in history. Car companies built aircraft engines. Typewriter factories produced machine parts. Shipyards expanded until they were cities of steel and sparks. Women, who had never before worked industrial jobs, took over assembly lines and transformed them into engines of victory. This was not merely production. This was reinvention. While Japan launched a new carrier every few years, The United States launched one every few months, sometimes every few weeks. And with each new hull that touched the water, the balance of power shifted further. Aircraft carriers were the heart of the new naval strategy. But behind them stood something even more important: the logistical armada. Thousands of transports, tankers, repair ships, fuel ships, floating workshops, supply vessels, medical ships, a moving city that followed the fleet wherever it went. It allowed U.S. forces to fight far from home, as if the entire American mainland was right behind them. No navy in history had ever done this. No other nation in the Pacific even attempted it. But industry wasn't just about quantity. It was about evolution. Every few months, American planes got faster. Every season, radar improved. Every year, carrier designs became more resilient. While Japan struggled to equip its experienced pilots, the United States trained thousands of new ones and equipped them with aircraft built on lessons drawn from every battle. The result was a force that did not simply grow. It matured. And this maturity allowed the U.S. to fight multiple simultaneous campaigns across thousands of miles of ocean. What had begun as a desperate defense was becoming a coordinated progression of island after island falling under American control. But victory in the Pacific was not only forged in factories. It was also built in the quiet, relentless work of planners and logisticians, the minds behind the vast supply lines that fed the fleet. They calculated fuel consumption across distances larger than continents. They mapped aircraft replacements down to the last bolt. They synchronized carrier groups like clockwork across time zones and storms. The Pacific Campaign was not a gamble, it was a timetable. And while Japan's strategy depended on early, overwhelming success, America's strategy was designed to grow stronger with time. The longer the war lasted, the more inevitable the outcome became. But industry and logistics, as powerful as they were, needed one more element: a method of advancing across the Pacific without getting bogged down in endless battles. A strategy that used the ocean's vastness as an advantage, not a burden. In the next part, we uncover that strategy, the plan that bypassed Japan's strongest defenses, isolated entire garrisons without firing a shot, and pushed the U.S. Navy closer and closer to the heart of the Pacific. A plan known today as island hopping. War is often imagined as a straight line, one army pushing against another, one front inching forward after every battle. But the Pacific was too big, too deep, too scattered for a straight line. It demanded something different, something flexible, something that would allow the United States to cross thousands of miles without fighting for every grain of sand. And that something became one of the most brilliant strategies of the entire war: island hopping. Before this strategy emerged, many believed the Pacific could only be won by capturing every island Japan held, one after another, slowly, painfully, with enormous losses. But the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps looked at the map and saw something else. Most of Japan's island garrisons did not need to be defeated. They only needed to be isolated. Japan had spread its forces thin, defending dozens of small islands, each requiring food, fuel, ammunition, medicine. If those lifelines were cut, the garrisons would remain on the map but cease to matter. So the U.S. made a radical decision: skip the strongholds, strike the weak points, and turn every bypassed island into a prison of sand. Imagine an island fortress with miles of trenches, bunkers carved into cliffs, guns hidden under camouflage nets. Japan expected the U.S. to smash directly into these walls like a hammer. Instead, the U.S. sailed past them. They bypassed entire divisions. They landed where defenses were light. They captured airfields that mattered and ignored those that didn't. Suddenly, Japanese strongholds found themselves cut off. No resupply, no reinforcement, no evacuation. The soldiers on those islands remained trapped, not defeated by battle, but defeated by geography. In some cases, those isolated garrisons survived until 1945 without seeing another enemy soldier. The U.S. had turned Japan's biggest strength, its vast island network, into its greatest weakness. But island hopping was more than strategy. It was adaptation. Each island was a different world: coral reefs, volcanic cliffs, dense jungles, endless mud, sharp rock, towering swamps. American forces had to develop skills for every environment imaginable. They built airstrips on atolls that barely rose above the sea. They dragged landing craft across reefs that shredded their hulls. They carved harbors out of volcanic rock and turned hostile jungles into forward bases. Every capture became a launch pad for the next. Every island taken pushed Japan farther into a corner. And behind every move stood the logistical engine we described earlier: fuel ships, repair vessels, supply convoys, all synchronized to keep the advance unstoppable. Yet the real brilliance of island hopping was psychological. Japan expected an enemy who fought in predictable patterns. They expected frontal assaults. They expected the U.S. to follow the logic of traditional warfare. But island hopping obeyed no such logic. It was unpredictable, fluid, strategic, in a way that forced Japan into constant reaction. When Japan fortified one island, the U.S. moved to another. When Japan reinforced a garrison, the U.S. cut the supply line instead. When Japan prepared for a massive showdown, the U.S. simply didn't show up. Japan was fighting the war it prepared for. The United States was fighting a completely new kind of war. By 1944, the effect was unmistakable. The U.S. Navy was advancing faster than Japan could reposition. Airfields appeared like stepping stones across the Pacific, each one bringing American bombers closer to Japan's industrial heartland. The circle was tightening, and Japan's ability to respond was shrinking by the day. But strategy alone did not end the war. To finish it, the U.S. needed one more element: dominance in the sky. In the next part, we examine how American air power became the final force that shifted the Pacific War into its final, relentless phase. At the beginning of the Pacific War, Japan's strength in the sky was undeniable. Its pilots were experienced, its aircraft were agile and deadly, and its early victories created the impression that American aviation simply could not compete. Many U.S. pilots entered combat knowing they were facing opponents who had trained longer, fought more often, and mastered tactics the Americans had barely studied. But by 1943, the balance in the air was no longer the same. The shift did not happen in a single moment. It moved slowly, steadily, built from thousands of decisions and adjustments that transformed the air war from the inside out. The first signs appeared far from the front lines, in classrooms, training ranges, and mechanic schools spread across the United States. Japan relied on elite professionals who had grown strong through years of conflict. The U.S. relied on a different idea: a system that could produce disciplined pilots in large numbers, month after month, without exhausting its talent pool. It wasn't glamorous, but it was effective. Training became standardized. Carrier landings were drilled repeatedly. Navigation, formation flying, and gunnery were taught with procedures rather than intuition. By the time an American pilot reached the Pacific, he was entering the war with a foundation that Japan simply could not match at the same scale. Japan had no way to replace its lost veterans. The U.S. replaced them continuously. Technology reinforced this trend. Japan's early aircraft were brilliant in their own way, fast, agile, unmatched in turning fights. But they were light, unprotected, and vulnerable to sustained fire. American engineers learned quickly. They focused not on replicating Japan's agility, but on building aircraft that could survive damage and deliver heavier strikes. The F-6F Hellcat became the symbol of this change, a rugged carrier fighter that protected its pilot, could absorb punishment, and still return home. It did not need to outturn its opponent. It only needed to endure long enough to bring its guns to bear. Later came the F-4U Corsair, a powerful, fast machine that changed the tone of air engagements. Where early American pilots had once dreaded combat, they now entered battles with machines designed to give them every advantage. This shift in hardware slowly erased Japan's early edge. Yet another transformation happened on the decks of the carriers themselves. During the first year of the war, Japan's flight crews operated with seamless coordination, the result of long experience. But as U.S. naval aviation expanded, its deck procedures became increasingly efficient and predictable. Launch cycles were refined. Refueling and rearming became safer. Radar-guided interception routines shortened response times. Carrier groups could now direct fighters long before an enemy attack reached striking distance. Japan, which once relied on surprise, began losing the element that had defined its early victories. Its aircraft were seen earlier, intercepted earlier, and forced into battles on American terms. As the U.S. advanced across the Pacific, the capture and construction of new airfields created a chain of stepping stones stretching closer and closer to Japan. Each airfield doubled as a base for fighters and bombers, a supply hub, a repair center, a launching point for the next operation. Japan's defensive perimeter, once spread across thousands of miles, was shrinking rapidly. Long-range aircraft could now strike targets that Japan once considered unreachable. Supply centers, fuel depots, and shipyards found themselves under continuous pressure. The effect was cumulative. Japan was not only losing aircraft in battle, it was losing the ability to replace them, to train new pilots, and to protect the infrastructure that kept its war effort alive. By late 1944, Japan's early dominance in the air had faded into memory. Its pilots faced overwhelming numbers, flew machines that could not keep pace with American improvements, and fought under conditions that were no longer in their control. American air superiority was now a permanent presence in the Pacific. It shaped every convoy, every amphibious landing, every naval movement. The sky had become a shield for the U.S. advance across the ocean and a wedge that broke apart Japan's strategic planning. Control of the air did not end the war by itself, but from this point onward, Japan could no longer choose where or how the next battles would be fought. The direction of the conflict was now set from above. As the United States pushed across the Pacific, shifting from defense to momentum, a new factor began to shape the conflict more than any other: range. Range meant striking power. Range meant pressure. Range meant that Japan's distance, once its greatest shield, was slowly, methodically, disappearing. The American advance, built on air superiority and logistical strength, created an arc of bases stretching thousands of miles. What began on tiny atolls grew into a chain of fully functioning airfields, capable of supporting operations deeper and deeper into territory Japan had believed unreachable. This was a turning point unlike Midway or Guadalcanal. There was no single dramatic moment, no one-day shift. It was a slow tightening, a strategic recalculation that forced Japan to fight a war for which it no longer had the resources. The first critical step came with the capture of the Gilbert and Marshall Islands. These weren't famous battlegrounds for the public, but for planners they were essential. Their airstrips became platforms from which American bombers could reach the next link in the chain. From there, aircraft could hit shipping routes, supply depots, fuel convoys, and communication lines that Japan desperately needed to maintain its empire. Every destroyed transport ship meant fewer supplies reaching isolated garrisons. Every damaged warehouse meant one more delay in Japan's already strained logistics. By 1944, Japan was fighting not just a military enemy, but geography itself. Then came the Marianas, Saipan, Tinian, Guam. Their importance cannot be overstated. They were not simply islands to be taken. They were positions from which the United States could reach places that had been out of reach for the entire war. From these runways, new aircraft, massive, long-legged bombers, could cross the open Pacific and return safely. It meant cities, industrial zones, dockyards, and transportation hubs were no longer protected by distance. The air war was no longer limited to the edges of Japan's empire. It could now touch the interior. Japan knew this. Its leadership had long feared a moment when an enemy could strike from afar without relying on vulnerable carrier groups. That moment had arrived. But long-range aviation was not only about offense, it changed the entire rhythm of the war. Now American ships moved under a shield of aircraft operating from distant bases. Japanese submarines found fewer openings. Convoys could advance more confidently. Island landings could be supported by bombardments launched from hundreds of miles away. Distance, once a barrier, had become a tool. Japan's commanders faced a new kind of pressure, constant, unbroken, coming from angles impossible to predict. Every priority became urgent. Every problem became immediate. Every front felt exposed. That strain was cumulative. Modern war is not only about battles. It is about what constant pressure does to a nation's ability to coordinate, react, and recover. Japan's ability to react was shrinking. Long-range power also reshaped naval warfare. Carrier groups, once the centerpiece of operations, now worked in coordination with land-based aviation. The U.S. could project air power from multiple directions simultaneously, a capability Japan could not counter. American radar, which had quietly matured over the course of the war, now guided both fighters and bombers with improved accuracy. Strikes became more precise, interceptions more frequent. Surprise, Japan's greatest early war weapon, had all but vanished. The Pacific had transformed from an ocean of uncertainty into a battlefield, mapped by signals, patrols, and long-range reconnaissance. American commanders could now plan operations not in terms of risk, but in terms of inevitability. As the pressure expanded, Japan faced a reality it had never prepared for: a sustained air campaign that targeted the infrastructure supporting its war effort. Factories that once supplied engines and weapons now struggled to meet even minimal output. Transportation networks suffered repeated disruption. Fuel shortages limited training flights and diminished the effectiveness of experienced crews. Each strike did not simply destroy a target. It weakened Japan's ability to wage the next month of war. The cumulative effect was a slow, unavoidable erosion of strategic capability. And with each lost capability, the distance between Japan and defeat shrunk a little more. The war was transitioning from contested open waters to a tightening circle around an enemy running out of time, fuel, replacements, and options. As American range expanded and the pressure on Japan intensified, the war entered a phase defined less by dramatic battles and more by something quieter, but far more decisive: the slow collapse of Japan's ability to recover. For every aircraft Japan lost, replacing it required factories that were running out of materials. For every pilot shot down, training a new one required fuel that no longer existed. For every island isolated, The supplies needed to sustain it had to cross waters now dominated by U.S. submarines and long-range patrols. Japan had not been built for a long war. Its early victories had created an illusion of momentum, a sense that rapid advances would force a political solution before its structural weaknesses became fatal. But once the United States seized the initiative, momentum no longer protected Japan. It revealed how fragile the entire system had been from the beginning. One of the clearest signs of this collapse was the transformation of the Japanese naval air arm. In 1941 and 1942, Japan's carriers were staffed with elite aviators, men who had trained for years in complex, demanding programs designed to create specialists. But those specialists proved irreplaceable. As attrition accelerated, Japan attempted to rapidly expand its pilot training pipeline. What emerged was a system with neither the time nor the fuel to recreate the professionalism of earlier years. Training hours dropped, flight practice was shortened, complex maneuvers were removed from instruction, new pilots were often sent into combat with only a fraction of the experience their predecessors had possessed. When these inexperienced aviators met a U.S. force flying rugged, well-armed aircraft and backed by organized carrier groups, the result was predictable and devastating. It was not simply a decline in skill. It was a collapse of an entire doctrine built on excellence that could no longer be sustained. Logistics mirrored the same decline. Japan's merchant fleet, which had once supported an empire spread across vast distances, was being destroyed faster than it could be rebuilt. American submarines, operating with increasing coordination, struck tankers, transports, coal ships, and raw material convoys with relentless precision. Each loss weakened Japan's ability to move fuel, iron ore, bauxite, rubber, and even food to the factories that depended on them. By 1944, Japan was losing ships faster than it could construct them. The flow of supplies that once connected its islands, armies, and industries had narrowed to a trickle. This logistical starvation affected every branch of its military. Aircraft, grounded for lack of fuel. Ships immobilized at anchor. Factories operating only part-time. Training programs cut to the minimum. Entire garrisons left isolated. War is movement, and Japan could no longer move. Meanwhile, American forces were doing the opposite. Every advance created new nodes of supply. Every captured island became a base. Every month added more ships, more planes, more trained personnel. The contrast between the two sides grew so sharp that some U.S. commanders began describing operations not as battles, but as systems. Systems of logistics, systems of air coverage, systems of naval protection. Japan was no longer facing individual operations. It was facing a continuous machine that replaced its losses faster than Japan could understand them. The psychological impact of this shift was just as damaging as the material one. For years, Japanese commanders had believed in the power of decisive battles, single, overwhelming engagements that would crush an enemy's will. But as 1944 progressed, those opportunities vanished. The U.S. refused to offer a single target. It advanced along multiple axes, forcing Japan to divide resources that were already too thin. Every attempt to concentrate forces risked exposure to air attacks or interception by American fleets. Japan's strategy was built on the idea of surprise and rapid shock. But when the enemy acted predictably, methodically, and with overwhelming numbers, surprise no longer mattered. The war was dissolving into a pattern that Japan could not interrupt. The strain became visible in every report. Pilots requesting more training they could not get. Commanders calling for fuel that no longer existed. Factory managers asking for materials that never arrived. Even in Japan's high command, there was recognition that the situation was deteriorating beyond recovery. Yet the war continued, not because there was hope of victory, but because withdrawing was politically unthinkable. The result was a nation fighting with diminishing tools against an enemy whose strength seemed to grow with each new month. And as this imbalance deepened, the fighting moved toward territories that Japan had once believed would never see combat. By the end of 1944, the Pacific was no longer a contested space. It had become a wide arc of American-controlled airfields, supply hubs, and naval routes stretching across thousands of miles. Japan, once an expanding empire, was now being pushed into a shrinking perimeter, where every movement, every convoy, every strategic decision had to fight against the pressure of geography and American initiative. The fall of the Marianas marked the most significant shift. With Saipan, Tinian, and Guam in American hands, the Pacific War entered a new phase, one where Japan's home islands were no longer distant symbols on the map, but reachable targets within operational range. For Japan's leadership, this was the moment when the war transitioned from difficult to desperate. The new American bases in the Central Pacific did more than extend range. They created the possibility of continuous pressure, a campaign that did not pause for seasons or supply shortages. Japan's cities, industries, and transportation networks could now be reached by aircraft without relying entirely on carriers. More importantly, these new positions connected the entire American advance into a single, coherent system. Airfields supplied naval operations. Naval operations protected convoys. Convoys fed Marine and Army assaults. Assaults captured more airfields. Each success reinforced the next. Japan, by contrast, was forced to defend in isolation. Bases that once communicated freely now depended on rare convoys that often never arrived. The strategic collapse was most visible in Japan's ability to conduct coordinated operations. Early in the war, Japanese fleets could move across the Pacific with speed and confidence. By 1944-45, any movement risked detection by American submarines, reconnaissance planes, or long-range patrol groups. This forced Japan to scatter its efforts, to defend too many places with too few resources. It could no longer mass its forces without exposing them to overwhelming American firepower. Attempts to reinforce positions often ended with convoys destroyed before they reached their destination. Planes meant for frontline bases ran out of fuel before they could be delivered. Even trained pilots had to ration flight hours, because every drop of aviation gasoline was now a strategic asset. War had become a calculation Japan could no longer afford. Meanwhile, the U.S. Navy was executing operations with a degree of coordination that had no precedent in naval history. Carrier task groups moved in large, rotating formations, ensuring that fresh planes and rested crews were always available. Fast carrier strikes crippled Japanese facilities before defenders could organize. Radar-guided interceptions made large-scale enemy attacks rare and costly. Japan was still fighting, but often with units that were weary, undersupplied, and lacking the training needed to confront fleets that operated like clockwork. Every American gain widened the gap. Every Japanese loss deepened it. The fall of the Philippines illustrated this widening fracture. For Japan, the Philippines were a vital bridge, a connection to resources in Southeast Asia, a shield against the advance of the American fleet, and a symbol of regional influence. When U.S. forces returned, Japan attempted to resist with everything it had left. But the earlier collapse of logistics, combined with shrinking air power and the dominance of American carrier groups, turned resistance into costly delays rather than effective defense. The defeat severed Japan's connection to vital fuel sources. Ships no longer had steady supply. Aircraft could not train or deploy in meaningful numbers. Factories inside Japan were cut off from raw materials. The empire was folding inward. With each passing month, the war moved closer to Japan's home islands. Airfields in the Marianas allowed long-range bombers to strike industrial centers that had once operated without interference. Ports that once welcomed raw materials now struggled to unload the few shipments that managed to slip through American patrols. The pressure was continuous, a steady weight from all directions that left Japan with fewer resources and fewer strategic choices. The war was no longer defined by territory captured or lost. It was defined by speed, logistics, fuel, and the ability to sustain operations under conditions of near-total pressure. By late 1944 and early 1945, Japan was fighting a war that had already shifted from offense to survival. The outer defenses had collapsed, the circle had closed, and the conflict moved into a phase that would test Japan more severely than any battle fought before. By 1945, the Pacific War had taken on a shape that few could have predicted in its early days. What began with shock, confusion, and heavy American losses had transformed into a campaign defined by overwhelming coordination, superior logistics, and strategic momentum that Japan could no longer reverse. The circle around Japan was now fully formed, a tightening ring of bases, fleets, and air power that reached across the ocean with increasing precision. Each captured position fed the next operation. Each new airfield brought Japan's cities and infrastructure further within reach. Each disrupted convoy deepened shortages that no emergency measure could repair. Japan was still resisting, often fiercely, but the broader reality had become clear. The war was being shaped not by individual battles, but by an accumulation of forces that Japan could no longer match. The U.S. had achieved something rare in military history: a complete synthesis of industrial production, strategic planning, and long-range operational capability. Factories in the United States were working at a scale that eclipsed every other nation involved in the conflict. Aircraft, ships, vehicles, ammunition, they were produced faster than Japan could destroy them and delivered across the Pacific with logistical coordination that functioned like a vast, moving network. Every damaged ship could be repaired. Every lost aircraft could be replaced. Every new operation could be supplied with fuel, food, parts, and reinforcement, without the long delays that crippled Japan's defensive efforts. Japan, by contrast, was forced into a cycle of depletion: shortages of fuel, shortages of steel, shortages of trained personnel, and shortages of time. The contrast grew sharper with every month that passed. Another decisive factor was adaptability. American commanders reshaped their methods as soon as patterns emerged. Carrier task forces learned to strike from multiple angles to overwhelm defenses. Submarines shifted to coordinated patrols that severed Japan's supply routes. Air units developed new bombing techniques, experimented with formations, and used radar and signals intelligence to plan increasingly accurate operations. Japan's defensive strategy, built on assumptions from earlier conflicts, struggled to keep pace. It lacked fuel for training, ships for repositioning, and the time required to rethink doctrines under constant pressure. Every adjustment Japan attempted ran into the same obstacle: a shortage of resources to execute those adjustments effectively. As American forces approached Japan's home islands, the war began to reveal the final consequences of the strategic divide that had grown for years. Positions like Iwo Jima and Okinawa became symbols of the conflict's severity. Japan defended them with determination, hoping to slow the advance and force strategic reconsideration. But even the enormous cost of these battles could not change the broader dynamics. Each island fell after prolonged resistance. and each one became another base from which American aircraft could patrol, strike, and coordinate. Japan's air defenses weakened further as fuel shortages, grounded aircraft, and industrial facilities struggled to replace damaged equipment. Shipyards faced similar challenges, unable to repair damaged vessels or produce new ones fast enough to restore any meaningful naval presence. The infrastructure of war was simply no longer functioning. The final months of the conflict were defined by an imbalance that had become impossible to correct. Japan's strategic options narrowed to defensive lines that could not be reinforced. Its airfields, refineries, and factories were under constant threat. Its supply routes were broken. Its navy had been reduced to a fraction of its former size. By contrast, the United States now operated with full freedom of movement, supported by carrier groups, long-range bombers, amphibious forces, and supply fleets capable of sustaining operations indefinitely. Where Japan struggled to fight day by day, the U.S. planned operations months in advance. The outcome was shaped less by single decisions and more by the convergence of all the factors built over the previous years. Industrial capacity, strategic adaptability, control of the air, control of the sea, disruption of enemy logistics, and a steady advance that never paused. In war, the side that can keep fighting after the other has reached exhaustion usually prevails. By 1945, Japan had reached exhaustion. The United States had not. When the conflict finally ended, it marked not just the defeat of an empire, but the confirmation of a fundamental truth about the Pacific War. Victory did not come from one battle, one technology, or one commander. It came from a system, a coordinated, evolving, relentless system that combined strategy, production, logistics, and innovation into a force Japan was never prepared to face. The war that had begun with a surprise attack on American waters ended with a demonstration of strategic reach on a scale the world had never seen. And that, more than any single event, explains why the United States won the Pacific War.